Joining us now on ICANN Media is Vivian Krause. She was one of the keynote speakers here at the N4 Petroleum Safety Conference. Your topic, a little bit different than what the other speakers were talking about. They were talking about health and safety. You're talking about a campaign against the oil sands, which of course is very relevant here in this province. Tell us a little bit about your speech.
Yeah, well, I think you're right. I've been talking about a topic that's been taboo, which is the American funding of environmental and First Nations activists in Canada. So what I did is I presented some of the research findings from my research. Over the last few years, I've gone through, I guess, more than 100,000 pages of tax returns, and I've researched the funding on 80 organizations, environmental groups and First Nations groups that are involved in the campaigns against various pipelines. Keystone, Northern Gateway, Energy East, pipelines that would reach the Arctic, and other pipelines. And what I found is that, to the best of my knowledge, every single group that is funded as part of this anti-pipeline campaign is funded by a single source, a group of large donors in California, and through their charitable foundations, they have paid more than 80 million over the last 5 years to the various campaigns against the pipelines. There's various interpretations of that. What does it mean? One interpretation is that the First Nations and the environmental groups are bought and paid for. I don't agree with that, because I think with or without American funding, these groups would be looking over the shoulder of industry and keeping government on its toes, which is good. That's the way it should be. The other interpretation is that that the environmental groups are calling the shots, and that it doesn't matter where the money comes from. I think it does, because actually these American funders, most of them don't even accept unsolicited proposals. They have written strategy papers. They have an agenda. And because getting Canadian oil to global markets is such an important national issue for Canada, and because the amount of money that's gone towards these anti-pipeline campaigns is so large, and the funders are people like the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, I think that the issue of who's funding the campaign needs to be out in the open.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, so my hope, as you know, Alberta begins this new chapter, is that the new leadership will take the initiative to begin a conversation, begin a dialogue with the environmental groups, with the First Nations groups, and also with the big American funders. As I understand it, they have 4 goals, and on 3 of them, I think we can agree. They want more renewable energy, that's good. They want better use of energy, greater energy efficiency, that's good too. They want energy security for North America, we can agree there too. It's on the 4th point I think that Canada needs to respectfully disagree, because that 4th point is that there should be severe restrictions put on the Alberta oil industry. Meanwhile, these California funders are not funding any sort of a large campaign against oil production in Texas and North Dakota, where, as we know, until the recent crash in the prices, there's been a boom in oil production. So the issue is, do we keep carbon in the ground, right? And we're using it at a rate of 1,000 barrels a second. That's pretty fast. So I think we need to think about that very seriously. But I think the main issues that I've been trying to bring to light are transparency and fairness.
Do you think that they're targeting the oil sands, or are they targeting Canada?
Well, I mean, the oil sands are in Canada, right? What I see happening is that they're targeting the oil industry in Canada. Meanwhile, and there's a multi-million-dollar campaign against the oil industry in Alberta. Meanwhile, there's no such thing against Texas or North Dakota.
Why is it that they want to keep Canadian oil in the ground, outside of the environmental aspect of it?
Well, that's the first question that I hope that the leadership of Alberta, the new leadership, will search an answer for. You know, I started a blog a few years ago and I called it Fair Questions, because I don't have all the answers. I don't pretend to have all the answers. But I think that's why that's the first question we need to ask, is why have you let the oil industry boom in Texas over the last 5 years, done nothing to slow it down there? Meanwhile, the same funders are putting the screws to Alberta.
One of the things that struck me during your presentation is it's the same oil companies that are working in both countries in many cases. So why is it that they're, you know what I mean? Like, because BP is up, well, BP's British, of course, but I mean, Esso's up here. The other big companies are up in Alberta as well as being represented in the States. Why is it they're not, I guess, more active when it comes to fighting this?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question, because I'm often asked, you know, do you see commercial interest here, the refineries? And I always say I have seen no evidence of any commercial interest. In other words, no evidence that a particular refinery in the U.S. is trying to secure its future supply or something like that. What I do see is that this campaign, the main funders of it are the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, the Oak Foundation, Sea Change, a number of other other California-based foundations that are all part of an umbrella organization, and they coordinate amongst themselves. And as I said earlier, I think their interests are renewable energy. In fact, in their strategy paper, they say that they're making Alberta oil the poster child for the campaign against fossil fuels. So I think, you know what, the thing is, if you're going to penalize based on carbon emissions, well, there's some oil produced in Alberta that has lower carbon emissions than some of the oil coming, especially out of California, right? So the issue here is fairness.
How do you get fairness in? Because some of the points you made is that they're not informing people with the right information. You know, they're spewing lies is basically what you said.
Well, I think fairness, you have to fight for it. And, you know, getting Canadian oil to global markets is breaking the U.S. monopoly on our oil. Right now, because we lack these pipelines, there's no way to get Canadian oil to the ocean. So Canadian oil is forced into the U.S. market. That means the U.S. has us over a barrel. They can buy oil from Canada at a cheaper price than they could buy it from any other country. So what this means in essence is that Canada is subsidizing the cost of oil in the U.S. and the price of gas to the tune of billions of dollars every year. And this needs to stop, because it's not in Canada's interest, it's not fair. That's why, as Canadians, we need to work together so that we can build these pipelines so that they respect the traditional territories of First Nations and find ways to get to the coast while not disrupting important ecological areas. But you know, we have a big coast. If you go from the 49th parallel to the south of Alaska, it's a long coast. It's 8 times the length of the coast of California. Somewhere in there's got to be space for a pipeline. You know, that's the thing that I think is important. Is right now there's an environmental initiative in British Columbia called the Great Bear Rainforest, right? Well, when it was first funded by the Rockefeller Brothers Fund in the late 90s, it was a small area, you know, a logically sized area. It was sort of the traditional habitat of the Coyote bear. But now they're calling the Great Bear Rainforest the entire area from the north tip of Vancouver Island to the south of Alaska. So it covers every square inch where a tanker might get through. So this Great Bear Rainforest has become the great trade barrier.
So I'm curious, some people might say big oil has had its way for decades. It's had all the money, it's had all the power. Maybe this is just a shift and things are balancing out now.
Well, I think it's kind of apples and oranges. You know, people often say, well, why don't you talk about the foreign investment in the oil industry? And I think that's important too. But, you know, for years, many journalists have looked into the foreign funding, written about it, exposed the foreign funding in the Alberta oil industry. So nobody looked at the foreign funding that the environmental and the First Nations groups were getting. So I thought, because the amount of money is so large, you know, the Tides Foundation alone, I've traced about 25 million, more than 250 payments to 80 organizations. So when you have one big donor whose identity isn't known, we don't know exactly where that money is coming from. I think because the money is so large and the issue is so important, that in the interest of transparency, we need to know who's funding this.
And you said the transparency is, well, it's more transparent in the U.S. than it is here in Canada.
Well, the disclosure rules, yeah. The IRS requires more information to be disclosed by charities than the CRA. For instance, in the U.S., charities have to disclose the names of the 5 highest paid employees. They have to disclose the names of the 5 top companies that they pay and the amounts and what the payments were for. They have to disclose where their funds are invested. And that's important if you have a $1 billion foundation, right, with $7 or $8 billion in assets. And they also have to disclose, well, they don't have to, but the big foundations disclose where the money's coming from, who's donating to them. And in the interest of transparency, I think we need to know if there are any competing interests, especially, you know, now that we see the rail industry, for example, is benefited. And, you know, there are huge economic benefits that are accruing outside of Canada to the fact that Canadian oil is being landlocked within North America.
So why did you take up this cause then? Is this something you did on your own? Or it is. How do you go about starting something like this on your own, and why?
Oh, I basically stumbled into this completely by accident. I started in 2007, and at the time, I was looking at the funding of the campaign against salmon farming. I had worked in the salmon farming industry in 2002 and 2003. That's, you know, more than 10 years ago. I was out of the industry, and then I actually, as a director of a nonprofit, the Adoptive Families Association, I was actually looking for grant funding for our nonprofit when I stumbled across the first of the grants on the campaign against salmon farming. So I kind of kept track of that for a couple of years. years. And then it was in 2010 when I noticed, these three little words that kept popping up over and over again: tar sands campaign, tar sands campaign, tar sands campaign. Again, in the tax returns, and this was the 2009. So this was the 2009 tax return for the Tides Foundation. And at that time, there was no anti-Keystone campaign, there was no anti-Gateway campaign. So I wondered, well, what is the tar sands campaign? And I wrote about this for the first time for the Financial Post in 2010, just as a member of the public, because I had seen the campaign against the salmon farming industry and how it had devastated that industry, brought it to its knees. And now what I was seeing was the exact same people who had run the campaign against salmon farming were now targeting Alberta oil. And I realized that the economic significance of this to Canada was going to be big. So we needed to know what's going on, right? You can't solve a problem if you don't understand it. And I feel that environmental activism has been misunderstood because we haven't looked at it from a marketing and a trade perspective. We've missed the fact that by exaggerating environmental problems, that market and trade and economic interests get protected. Right? So the thing with these environmental campaigns is that there is a grain of truth to them, right? The oil industry does have environmental impacts. The environmentalists are demarketing Alberta oil. So then we have to that means they're trying to shift demand and especially investment. They're trying to shift investment capital away from the Alberta oil industry. So if there is a sound case for that, then that makes sense. I would argue that some of the reasons they give for demarketing Alberta oil are not sound. They say things, for example, that it takes 4 barrels of water to produce a barrel of oil. That's outdated. They say that the carbon emissions of Alberta oil are 3 or 4 times what they are of, or 2 or 3 times what they are of the average American oil. That's an exaggeration as well. So you're absolutely right when you said earlier that we need to get to the facts. And I think that there isn't a strong case, there isn't a sound case for trying to shift investment capital away from the Canadian energy industry, and that's why I think the energy industry needs to address this campaign.
So you started this on your own. Are you still doing the research and looking into this all on your own without funding from anybody else?
Well, I'm not funded by anybody. But what has happened over the last year is because of my research, the oil industry has finally taken some interest in it. I started writing about this in 2010, and at first everybody kind of laughed at it, and no one was interested. And it wasn't until President Obama rejected the Keystone pipeline that then people started to say, who was that woman in Vancouver and what was she saying? So what's happened is, now we're 2015, and now that the Gateway pipeline has run into trouble, the Trans-Canada pipeline, the Keystone's run into trouble, I'm convinced that whoever wants to put through the Energy East is going to run into the exact same opposition. So now I think the energy industry is finally starting to say, hey, maybe we need to take this seriously. So to finish answering your question, over the last year I've been invited to speak at a number of conferences, including in fact this is the only conference that I'm speaking at this year, but at least as I know of so far. So it's because of the honorariums of speaking at conferences like this that I have been sort of able to limp along, if you will. But it's there's no sort of ongoing funding whatsoever.
Last question for you. You're hoping the oil industry gets a little bit more involved and starts putting out the message. I believe that's part of their plan as well. It's something they talk about. It's something they just have to get going on a little bit more. But the other thing is, what would you hope Canadians take out of this when they look at it? Because they're reading articles in the paper, they're watching stories on TV, they're checking the internet, and they're seeing strong messages coming from both sides. What is it the public's supposed to look at and come away from all of this?
Well, the public was going to have a hard time making informed decisions and making informed opinion until the industry steps up and provides the public with the facts. So I guess what I am hoping is that the oil industry gets competitive. We shouldn't look at this as some sort of a conspiracy against Canada, no. But what we do need to look at this and say is, hey, there's a marketing campaign against Canadian oil. It used to be that the oil industry had a monopoly, if you will, on transportation fuel, right? In the exact same way, actually, that commercial fisheries used to be the only source of fish. Then aquaculture came along, and all of a sudden commercial fisheries have competition, right? Well, 10 years from now, oil isn't going to be the only fuel for transportation, right? There's already alternative sources of energy coming on, and that's going to increase. So oil industry is going to need to think more about its marketing and its branding.
Vivian, thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure.
We've been chatting with Vivian Krause here on ICANN Media.